ahead and get started because we have a lot to cover today and we have three incredible guests. So I will just kick it right off. Good afternoon and welcome back to Service Disrupted, which is a webinar from the American Foreign Service Association. And today we are going to be digging into the connection between storytelling, public perception, and public policy. And it's because here's the reality: when diplomacy and development are abstract, they are easier to underfund, sideline, and dismantle. And of course, we saw that unfold a year ago when USAID was publicly mocked and effectively closed, and its life-saving work reduced to a joke about a woodchipper. And millions of lives, of course, were impacted overseas, yet many here at home didn't even notice. I am Nikki Gamer, the Director of Communications and Outreach at the American Foreign Service Association, and I am going to be your moderator for the next hour. And if you are new to AFSA, and you most likely are not if you are here, we are both the professional association and the exclusive labor representative of the U.S. Foreign Service. Before we even begin, just a quick housekeeping note. We will have time for Q&A, and so if you have any questions for our amazing panel, as you listen to them speak, feel free to put those right into the Q&A, and we will try to get to as many of those questions as possible. With that, let us get started. So as I said, we have an amazing panel to explore this topic from multiple angles. So first, we are joined by Catherine Ntimoa. Yes, Ntiamwa. Great. Okay. A former U.S. Foreign Service officer with the State Department who spent nearly 20 years in public diplomacy with assignments across Africa, Europe, Asia, Latin America, serving as a public affairs officer and spokesperson at U.S. embassies representing multiple agencies. And today, she is a director for policy engagement and strategic partnerships at Indiana University's Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies. And she is on the editorial board of our own Foreign Service Journal. Catherine, welcome to our webinar. So excited to hear from you. Okay, next guest, Jessica Jennings, is a strategic communications executive who has spent her career helping mission-driven organizations tell their stories and help navigate high-stakes moments. And from 2002 to 2005, Jessica served as a spokesperson and then chief communications officer at USAID, overseeing communications for an agency that operated in more than 100 countries. Jessica, welcome. Happy to have you. And then finally, William Herkowitz is a journalist and communication strategist. From 2016 to 2025, he served as the head of communications at USAID missions in Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Kenya, where he now lives. His reporting and essays have appeared in the New York Times, Vice, Scientific American, Health Beat, and other outlets. William, I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you so much.
All right. Before we get into the diagnosis, I'm just going to briefly ground us in what actually happened with USAID. So as I said, 1 year ago in February, the U.S. Agency for International Development, an agency operating in more than 100 countries and responsible for life-saving humanitarian and development work for more than half a century, was publicly targeted and dismantled. Everything moved very quickly. Programs were halted, staff were villainized and discarded, partners around the world were left in limbo, and a once thriving sector collapsed. And decades of hard-fought and costly poverty alleviation gains were reversed seemingly overnight. William wrote an op-ed about this last year that ran in the New York Times and explained how the stark reality was that an agency responsible for supporting tens of millions of people could be dismantled with very little public outcry at home. So we're asking today this fundamental question about this moment. Do diplomacy and development have a PR problem? And if so, what is actually broken? And how do we fix it? So Catherine, I'm going to put you on the spot first. I think you can handle it. So for much of that time, the system rewarded quiet professionalism. And we talked about this before we got on this webinar. Being careful, being coordinated, staying out of the domestic spotlight. And it seems like that played out on multiple levels all at once. Institutionally, the focus seemed to be on explaining U.S. policies and values to foreign audiences instead of making the case here at home. Culturally, there seemed to be a strong instinct toward restraint, and individually, diplomats and development professionals were encouraged to stay behind the scenes. So, from your perspective, and I'll finally stop talking, how did that culture of invisibility take hold? And at what point did it stop protecting diplomacy and development and start making it more politically vulnerable?
Thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this event, and also thank you for the question. Um, for me, the culture of invisibility is really baked into decades of public diplomacy and U.S. foreign policy. I mean, diplomats were taught to focus on abroad, we're focused on staying coordinated, minimizing domestic exposure, and the point of view that we may be entangled with political changes. And we really are supposed to be a professional body of government officials who ensure that U.S. foreign policy, despite whatever administration is in power, that our most important work is to remain um, focused on the audiences and the foreign governments and populations that we are trying to influence. So visibility at home was always seen as risky, as unnecessary, and it stopped when we started protecting development and diplomacy. And it's also when domestic audiences became disconnected from the work. And so, as a Midwesterner, as an American, if they can't see it, if they can't understand it, if they don't have a stake in it, then then there's no way for us to protect it. So Congress treats the programs as optional, then the public assumes that these missions and our work are abstract, they're irrelevant, and then that gap becomes larger, which makes programs easy to be manipulated as political or vulnerable, no matter how impactful they truly are when they're overseas. So since leaving the Foreign Service, I've really tried to ensure that these stories, especially sitting where I am now in Indiana, make sure that they reach local communities, that I'm explaining as much as I can as possible to the importance of staying connected, and that invisibility is really something that hinders U.S. foreign policy because when students and educators and think tanks and government officials see this work as invisible, then it really exposes Americans and it makes us less safe, strong, or more prosperous. Thank you.
And I want to ask you just to follow on that, because you had said this before we got on this call, that your job as a diplomat in public diplomacy was to make sure things were behind the scenes, right? To make sure it was invisible. Can you just talk just for a second about the culture?
Yeah, so my job as a spokesperson, as a public affairs officer, was really to ensure that that embassy leadership, that our visiting VIP officials, when they were coming overseas, were really the face of American diplomacy. There were every single day the work that we did, writing our talking points, creating the social media, doing our exchange programs. And really shaping how U.S. foreign policy is understood abroad. There was teams of people that did it, but the only person that you would see typically are these VIPs, these acting, these assistant secretaries, these ambassadors, and really there were hundreds of people that made that work possible. And so we really came from a culture of propping up a figurehead when really it was lots of us doing that work and ensuring that U.S. foreign policy, no matter where we were in the world, continued.
I think that's so important. I was shocked when I started working for AFSA, just about the amount of times you're told as diplomats, don't, really don't be on social media. Don't be talking about what you do as much as you're just trying to make sure it's the work that is seen.
Mhm.
So like that culture and visibility really struck me. And then I just want you to talk for a second, because I think this is really important before we move to Jessica, about the Smith Modernization Act. Just explain what that is,
Sure.
was, and how that shaped how the US government could engage audiences here in the US versus abroad.
So most people don't know this, but Congress actually, for the longest time, ensured that it was enshrined in law that when we were explaining and engaging with U.S. foreign policy, that we were just engaging with foreign publics. And so with the Modernization Act that happened in 2012 really did fundamentally shift how the rules of engagement for U.S. public consumption of U.S. foreign policy and the diplomacy that we were doing abroad. Previously, content produced for international audiences could not be shared domestically at all. So that left kind of Americans out of the loop, and it left them out of understanding exactly why and how we were conducting U.S. foreign policy. So now with the modernization, U.S. funded media can be accessed by Americans on demand through broadcast, quality video, online, mobile, satellite, which I think is starting to crack the code in which U.S. Audiences can kind of understand why U.S. foreign policy is done the way that it's done, and that it really is a long game. So this is a huge shift because diplomacy and development are not abstract. They're linked to national security, to economic interest, and global stability. Modernization with the Smith-Mundt Act enables Americans to see their government's work in action, understand the relevance of it, and then also the outcomes and how it can impact their work, their day-to-day lives as Americans. It also increases transparency, which I think is really important. People can see and understand where the taxpayer dollars is and how it's being utilized and in action, and then judge the work for themselves. When we're in a representative democracy, you really want Americans to be able to judge the work and how their taxpayer dollars are being spent on a day-to-day basis because we're accountable. We were accountable for the work and how the money was being spent. So instead of relying on filtered and sometimes political interpretations of our work, they can go and see it themselves. All it just takes is just a little bit of practice in finding it, but otherwise. This act really did help to, or it intends to help with giving people a more complete understanding of the way and how U.S. foreign policy is done abroad.
It's so interesting because otherwise it just becomes a black box, and then you have to rely on the news media to cover it or not, right?
Exactly.
And to tell the stories. Okay, Jessica, I want to bring you in from a different angle. So you, an agency like USAID, where resources are tight and work is far from home, how does leadership tend to weigh comms, communications against other priorities, especially given the pressure from Congress to be efficient and effective with taxpayer dollars?
Thanks, Nikki. And before I start, I saw a lot of familiar names in the chat. So I just want to recognize that we have so many great, kind of former USAID and state communicators, probably some current ones too. And they have done outstanding work over the years. So I want to recognize all of them for that. I was very fortunate to work for an administrator who prioritized communications. And that looked like making sure that communications was at the table for big decisions to weigh in on how things might be perceived by domestic and international audiences, to help shape policy and programs with a communications lens, and who really charged our missions and our mission directors with putting communications at the heart of their work. And I think we were starting to see strong dividends from that before everything that transpired last January began. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, communications is essential to the work that we are doing as development experts and as diplomats. But there are really challenging systemic issues that make that work more complicated. First and foremost, as a development agency, you want to put as much money into the programmatic work as possible. And Congress had an extensively earmarked budget that we were working with as well. So it made the operating expenses budget even tighter, even greater. And you're really competing for really important resources that every team and every department needs. So leadership is constantly looking at how you allocate those resources to maximize the impact around the world. Second, there are ways that, USAID and state were previously structured that made communications a little bit more difficult than it needed to be. For example, when I started as spokesperson at USAID, I was actually a State Department employee. That was part of Jesse Helms's 1998 reform bill for USAID that consolidated the press office. And what it meant in practice was that in theory, particularly at missions and at embassies, USAID staff were not empowered to be able to share their story directly with the press. Social media changed that landscape a lot and gave a lot more equity and across the agency and across the landscape. But it's still an inherent challenge when you're a public affairs officer like Catherine was, and you're trying to juggle a million different priorities. And so for some missions, for some chiefs of mission, it wasn't a priority to communicate about international aid. And then finally, I would say, both across USAID and across state as well, people genuinely cared about the impact of the work that they were doing and making sure it was successful. And sometimes communicating about that work could jeopardize it. And so when you're trying to empower local leadership or create sustainable programs that local communities can really feel pride in, you don't then want to turn around and take all the credit for it back in a US audience where it's going to go immediately back across, international news wires. And so really getting that balance right between how we talk about our issues at home in a way that builds support, but also doesn't erode the work that we're trying to do in countries is fundamentally always going to be a bit of a conflict for communicators on these issues.
Is the tension that you just identified that we don't want to boast and say, oh, look what we did when we're really working through partners? And is that kind of what you're talking about?
That's a huge part of it. And I think also as well, we did some polling back immediately after the USAID dismantling. And some of the messaging that pulled best with US audiences was about stopping diseases before they reached American borders, stopping the border crisis before it reaches US borders. But that's not a message that will, resonate in a community where you're trying to help people participate in programs to increase economic opportunities or keep children in school. And so that kind of conflict will always be something that communicators and leaders across the development and diplomatic space will need to weigh.
And one more question is, do you think it's fair to fund the comms piece of USA, an agency like USAID, similarly to we do agencies like within our military, given that they're both part of national security?
I think, the choices on this are always going to be difficult, and the military has a specific thing around recruitment as well that is a little less in the state and USAID priority needs list. But I think ultimately, we are in a world now where state and USAID are under one roof. And my hope is very much that as this new reality comes together, that we continue to say this is a communications priority for our diplomatic needs and for keeping Americans safe. And so, while the dismantling was handled in just the completely most callous way possible for people who participated in the programs, for the staff at USAID and all of its partner agencies, my hope is that now we can focus on trying to make sure that everyone sees the value in communicating about the impact, both in the countries that we're working in and domestically here in the US.
Yeah, and figuring out a way to communicate that impact in a way, to your point about what Americans care about. Okay. So, William, I want to bring you into the conversation. So, you are a communicator for USAID stationed overseas. And you wrote this op-ed in the New York Times. What do you see as the PR failure, as you look at this story?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you for having me here. It's very interesting to hear Jessica and Catherine's perspectives. I agree with a lot of what both of you are saying, and I appreciate the work that you did and are doing. So thank you. I think first we're missing a little bit of context. I mean, the PR problem for aid is not just an American issue. It is an issue across the West. We are seeing a rollback in aid in Canada, in Britain, in Germany, you name it. And then even within the United States government, if we are being honest, a general incompetency for communicating our policy or programs, that it was not a USAID issue. This is an issue across government agencies. But when I think about our strategic weakness, I don't think that this was necessarily about funding or underperforming message or employee culture, but maybe something a little bit more profound, like an abdication of the concept that general public awareness is required in our society for foreign aid. And I want to be clear, I'm not criticizing my fellow panelists. I actually think that we all did our best with all the tools at our disposal. I just think at some deeper level, the federal government believed maybe Americans didn't want to hear about us helping other countries, and we acted as such. When I wrote in my op-ed about a drought that Americans were paying, I think it was $6 a year for about 3 years, and that conservatively saved about 3 million lives. I never met a single friend back home in the United States that knew that it was happening as it was happening. And when it ended, we didn't put out a public report, let alone any like real concerted effort to meet Americans where they get their news and tell them what they had done, what they had paid for. So I think what this adds up to, and kind of the explanation of where we are now, that failure you got to, is that like if you had never heard about the money you were spending to save lives, and then someone shows up and tells you it's like all woke transgender government fraud, like why not believe it? You've never heard anything else. Or if the Secretary of State lies to your face and says that we're cutting this work, but don't worry, no one is going to die, how do you know that it's false? So I just think those are worth keeping in mind.
No, absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up because the amount of mis and disinformation that was just so hard to break through with facts is so important. So how do you lay that groundwork then, right? Is that the question? How do you lay that
Yes.
groundwork? And so that it's not so easy to make up these lies, right? Catherine, I'm going to come back to you. Thank you both, to William and Jessica. You're in a college, you're with students, young people,
Yeah.
and what does that mean? As we talk to students about, when USAID is in the news, um, how do you engage them now? Looking at what happened with USAID, what are sort of the lessons that sort of have come to light for you as in the last year?
Well, it's been a journey over the last year. I think when I left the Department of State in July, I really wanted to ensure um, that people understood exactly why U.S. foreign policy and U.S. engagement is more important right now. I chose to come to the Midwest because I think that some of the greatest diplomats that we've had come from the Midwest, and that the Midwest really represents most average Americans in the way that they think about U.S. foreign policy. Um, I think it's imperative that if we're spending U.S. foreign policy money and U.S. taxpayer money, that we have to explain or at least attempt to explain why and how we're spending it, even if it means that people may not want to actively search for it. At least we're making the attempt to explain why and how we do it. There are many times that USAID, State Department, and other arms of the U.S. foreign policy apparatus were directly supporting American businesses. There are many times that even crops in the agricultural industry that are right here in Indiana were um, they were linked to some of the work that we were doing overseas. And there were American businesses that were making money and then creating the infrastructure that we had in order to carry out U.S. foreign policy. So I think it's really important that people know and explain and understand why and how we were spending the money and how it was benefiting not only the beneficiaries of the aid, but those that were creating the infrastructure to have the aid carried out. Um, so several things have changed. First, um, I think it's really important that we not only are explaining it, but that we're creating and cultivating the next generation of Americans who want to stay engaged. At Indiana University, for example, we teach 70 plus languages here at the school. And this is not an advertisement for Indiana University, but it is important to point out that there are students that are enrolling in some of the most niche languages that even the U.S. Department of State doesn't teach. It's also important to highlight that across many foreign policy programs across the United States, not just in Indiana, that they've had some of the highest enrollment for 2026-2027 school year. So it indicates to me that if we're still filling up these classes with these niche languages, that there's the highest enrollment across universities, that there is a need to keep explaining and to keep engaging and to keep talking about why it's important that the United States government stay actively engaged and that we cultivate the next generation of foreign policy practitioners who are nimble, who are able to be telling stories, and who are able to explain and cut through the noise in a really effective way. So that's how I see it from sitting at a university. I have students coming in and out of my office hours in addition to my regular work, wanting to stay engaged and wanting to know that, even over the next 250 years, as we celebrate America 250 and for 250 beyond, that while U.S. foreign policy is changing at a rapid pace and will continue to grow and change at a rapid pace, that they remain nimble, that they remain engaged, that they remain interested in the world around them, because we cannot do anything alone, despite what current administration may or may not say about how we engage abroad.
And just real quick before I move to Jessica, when your student walks in your office and they say, Catherine, you used to be a diplomat. Do most of them even know what is a diplomat? Because I know most people my age don't even know.
Yeah.
Does that surprise you?
Well, I think I'm really interacting with a really special type of student because they're already enrolled at the School of Global and International Studies. But in my work every day, so my title is Policy Engagement and Strategic Partnerships. That policy part really is exploring with students and how to connect what they're learning in the classrooms to what their careers might look like in the future. And so many times when students are coming into office hours or we're engaging in policy related discussions or events that I'm curating and creating for students, it's an opportunity for them to explore what foreign policy, what foreign affairs careers might look like. And that is, for example, on this chat, I invited a former diplomat in residence to come and lead a simulation for students in Chicago. That is inviting journalists, that's inviting think tank experts, that inviting academics to explain what a career in foreign policy and foreign affairs might look like. And so while I'm very upset actually that the diplomat in residence program was dismantled, it's also an opportunity to utilize some of the expertise that we've lost and to keep students engaged. So any way that I can utilize my budget, to utilize my influence, to utilize the programs that I create and initiatives that I drive forward, I try to utilize it so that students can stay engaged and understand. Oh, hi, Susan. That we can utilize the expertise and make sure that it doesn't get lost.
Got it. It looks like you have maybe a student on here.
Susan, yeah, was the former diplomat in residence that I engaged. So
Very good.
like her and many others, I continue to do programming monthly so that students can keep engaged and keep learning about diplomacy.
Yeah, we should do a whole webinar on that program, the diplomats in residence and what we lost anyway, but that's a different hour. Jessica, I want to move to you. What is one trade-off that leaders in the past might have been reluctant to make, but cannot avoid any longer when it comes to comms and marketing and awareness?
I like this question because I actually think stopping of thinking of it as a trade-off is important here. Comms needs to be embedded and invested into their programmatic work because it is part of what we do. I think particularly when we think about, and I'm just going to echo so many of Catherine's excellent points here, this next generation of leaders need to hear a very different message. We have a really great opportunity right now to present that message. You know, the KFF polling back in March of last year showed that more than 80% of people had heard about USAID's dismantling. That's a huge, massive number of people and really speaks to the amazing journalists who worked so hard to tell the story of what was happening and the amazing staff who worked so hard and so bravely to share what was happening in real time and to talk about what they were experiencing, and then all the programmatic impacts and everyone who has, stepped up, spoke to a reporter about what's happening in their country because of these cuts. So that has really changed the landscape of information that is out there. But now we need to also tell the story of what's still possible. And I think there is still so much great work that is happening. So many programs that have found other funding or are still receiving some amount of US government funding or have found other international donors who will step up into some of these spaces. And people need to hear the successes as well as the devastating impacts where the retreat has happened. And so my hope very much is that leaders both in and outside of government recognize that communications is essential to how we shape and influence policy, both in the countries that we're working in, but here in the US as well.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, 80%, that is astounding, that stat. That is quite an opportunity. And as a comms person, comms, and it's not just like to William's point, it's not just USAID, it's not just diplomacy, it's always last, I feel like, at big organizations. And I feel like this is such a lesson for leaders writ large about the importance of communications, especially when it comes to those supported by the public. William, before we we're going to go to audience questions, but I leave this last question for you. From your perspective, what would communicating diplomacy and development actually look like in practice? Maybe something that hasn't been done in the past that you would say should be done going forward.
Okay, I'm really excited about this. I mean, I have one impactful change, and I can give a very specific example, but I have to go broad first because what I'm talking about is basically transforming like how government agencies view the risk reward calculation in communications. So just as background, I cannot stress enough just how risk averse as an institution USAID was in communications and how hierarchical it was. And again, this was not just us. This is a problem across the government. But for USAID, the organizations who actually implemented our development work overseas often wouldn't touch American audiences because they knew, one, there was no benefit for them, and two, they would get in trouble if they did it without our express permission. I know because I was in charge of enforcing that in 3 countries. And then we in the field basically weren't allowed to handle American media engagement either. Everything was pushed back to Washington, and that absolutely makes sense from a messaging perspective, but you end up with this profound bottleneck with basically zero space for proactive messaging from the field to American audiences, except like at the highest echelon of comms and after this like very long and limiting process. So the change that I would recommend would be to unshackle these implementers from engaging with local media in the United States on their own terms. So this would include engaging with people like YouTube influencers, for example. And to the extent that the law will allow for it, you direct the people implementing your foreign aid with communicating the work back to taxpaying audiences. You mandate it. And not just national media, you aim lower. It would take very little money. I am actually working with a British foreign aid project on this issue right now. We're finding stories about industrial manufacturing overseas where the aid has like a direct benefit to British taxpayers. I mean, this is a bit more specific. It's like a self-centered approach for what is a self-centered moment. But the stories are there. I spoke to someone on last Tuesday who is expanding a factory into Wales from East Africa, which means more British jobs thanks to the work that's being done. And like with these stories, we are trying everything, reaching out to local radio within the UK, local news. I would like to be doing more with social media influencers, which is sadly where a lot of people get their, we're learning about the world. Is that enough? No. And I'm just imagining this happening at various levels with what used to be our countless USAID projects. Like, I'm sure that there would be enormous issue. Like, you would have to do this in a clever way. You would have to do this in a careful way, but you would get awareness. And awareness was the thing that we were missing. So that's my recommendation.
No, I think that it makes so much sense. I'm very curious, however, Jessica, to your reaction as someone who led USAID comms, what that would mean. I mean, what do you make of what William suggests, actually?
I want to recognize that for a lot of people who are working at our missions, that was very much the experience. And I think some of that really stems from those systemic issues that I talked about the kind of divides that were mandated, where USAID press office moved into the State Department press office, and some of the kind of risk reward assessments that leaders were constantly doing. I agree. The government inherently is risk adverse. And, I think there are good reasons for that. Because there is such tremendous responsibility and power that comes when you are communicating with the voice of the American government or any government. And so at the same time, I think what we were starting to see was shifts in that way, a lot more work with influencers. I saw when I visited our missions, in Papua New Guinea or in Angola, really creative communications work that was happening by those teams there, working incredibly long, complicated hours to figure out how to find amazing local influencers or amazing radio journalists who could really tell a story in a different way than what we traditionally did. And so I think what I would add to that is that lots of great communicators were doing that work. I would love to see it at such a wider and larger scale, especially, in my very strong hopes that we start to see a rebuild into the infrastructure of international development in the years ahead, and making sure that communications is a part of that. And then again, this conversation around how we communicate is so important, because there is, what is going to play well domestically in a US audiences is going to sometimes be at odds with what will play well in the countries that we communicate in. So there's no one size fits all on this. We have to constantly evaluate and calibrate our messaging. If I had one wish on how to calibrate that messaging, it's moving away from talking about dollars and moving much more to talking about impact. It's very traditional to see, and not just at USAID development and other agencies across governments, the announcement announcement of, another $200 million, a $1 billion funding announcement. And that confuses Americans who don't see the totality and how small actually that totality is. And it doesn't really speak to the impact that's happening on the ground. I would love to see announcements, social media collaborations, and things like that that are celebrating milestones of impact, medicines delivered, food assistance unlocked, young girls in school, and celebrating those milestones. So that would be my one wish for development communications ahead.
Yeah, I mean, but that's a catch 22 because you have to have good data that tells a story. And connecting those dots, having worked in humanitarian development comms, is not a straight line. And so,
Absolutely.
yeah, that's
And
tricky. It's tricky.
absolutely. And the information officers, for example, in the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, were amazing at trying to thread all of that together and that kind of structure being replicated. I see a question in the chat about how many staff, that kind of structure that really is centered around information and communications is so important. But again, it's a trade-off then from programmatic dollars. So there's no one easy solution here. It's that constant evaluation of what's going to work and what makes the most sense for each program, the type of work that we are trying to do, and the really, really critical importance of communicating it.
Just that idea of influencers, American influencers, and the reach that they have, which has become so, it's like comparable to these traditional media outlets, and pivoting in that way would be really interesting. Okay, I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Nadja Ruzika, who is going to field some audience questions. So Nadja, over to you.
Thanks, everyone. Great discussion. As usual, we have gotten a whole host of questions. Some of them are similar, so I've tried to group them as much as possible. As usual, they kind of span the spectrum. And so I'll just dive right into them. And in the meanwhile, if you have additional questions or we're not covering the ones that you submitted, just pop them into that Q&A. Okay, I'm going to start from the top down. Maybe, Catherine, I'll start with you. But the first question is how to understand the indifference of the US population about why development and diplomacy are important. And I want to start with you because I think it has historic roots back to our discussion about the Smith-Mundt Act.
I wouldn't characterize the current moment as indifference. I would characterize it as the overloading of information for most Americans. After living overseas for quite a while and coming back to the United States, I mean, it is very easy in our individualistic society to just have to focus on what you have to do to get from your 9 to 5, your children ready, surviving the economic fluctuations of the current moment, ensuring that your community around you is fulfilled, that you have a social life. There's like lots of competing priorities. And so if you unfortunately don't make the message that you're trying to communicate to people, that it has a direct impact on their day-to-day lives and the future generations of their children or the communities around them, then it's very hard to care. And I think as communicators, and when I communicate, specifically utilizing the platforms that I've started to utilize now that I'm out of the Foreign Service, I think it's really important to ensure that every message that you communicate, you have a goal in mind of who you're trying to communicate, why you're trying to communicate, and doing it multiple times in ways that make sense to who you're trying to communicate it to. So, for example, when I was in the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, we were celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Bureau's inception. In order for us to talk about all of the tremendous and amazing things that this Bureau had done over a 40-year period, I wanted to ensure that different populations heard the message different ways. So that meant that utilizing the American Diplomacy Museum, creating a museum, something at a museum so that people could see the historical roots of humanitarian assistance. That meant working with a local museum and bringing in their populations and the people that they were interacting with, and having them come over to the museum. That meant working with authors to talk about humanitarian assistance and documenting some of the work that humanitarians had done through that. looking and investigating all of the different humanitarian crises that the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration had positively influenced, and all of the possible outcomes and how it had directly connected to Americans, whether they're in the Midwest or in the East Coast or West Coast. So I tried to ensure that utilizing different mediums and reinforcing the message in different ways at different times of the day, and directly linking my goals to communication to different audiences. So I don't think it's a one-time, one act. It's reinforcing a message over and over and over again, and really getting to know who your audience is and who you want your target audience to be. It really is a constant recalibration that does not just happen overnight. It really is developing relationships and understanding what are the motivations of the people that I'm trying to reach. What do they care about day to day? What are the things that pull their attention? We're really in an attention economy right now. And if you don't have the message that links them and locks them in, then you're never going to have them. And so you have to keep thinking about who is the messenger that will, or the platform that will really lock in the people that we're trying to reach. And I mean, unfortunately, in the government, for example, at PRM, there's only three of us. There was three of us to tell the government the story of a bureau that had almost a $5 billion budget. I could spend all day long telling the story, and I could never get it out as many times as I wanted to. So unless the resources are there, and it also meant that I had to be in the room when decisions were being made, when we were thinking about policy and the way we wanted to communicate it. I wanted to sit in at the beginning. I wanted to sit in when the budget was being formulated. I wanted to sit in when we were thinking about, okay, we're going to have a refugee coordinator go overseas. What's the story you want to tell right now? How can you tell your story? What are the pictures that I need? What is the video that I need? What do I need in order to tell the story so that it makes sense not only to the taxpayers, but to the people that are funding these humanitarian actions, and how are we going to talk about it to the future generation or to American citizens? So really it meant forcing myself into every single room that I could in order to ensure that the story that I wanted to tell was complete, and that the people that were going to be influencing and carrying out U.S. humanitarian assistance understood that their job was also a storyteller. It wasn't just my job; it was everybody's job. And so that's how I approached the work. But it was difficult without the right amount of human and financial resources.
Yeah, it does sound like, I mean, as we've diagnosed the problem, what we're reaping now is decades of structural and financial decisions, right? That it's not necessarily a lack of desire to understand on behalf of Americans, but it's the investment. We haven't made the investment into it. I have a related question, and I think I'll start with Jessica and then definitely want William's input as well. It's a related question on, so we've diagnosed it's not necessarily a lack of interest or an indifference, but do we think that there's a ceiling on US public interest in understanding of what this work is? Given everything that's happening in our own country, and especially now, is it realistic to expect, in terms of generating societal understanding of the value of this work, when it's so small in dollar and people terms? Or are we always going to be vulnerable due to an inherently limited constituency for this type of work? Jessica, let's start with you.
I think Catherine really said it best when she laid out all the things that the average American person is thinking about and dealing with. So I do think there is a limitation to what we can expect people to do in response to foreign aid cuts. But at the same time, the polling shows consistent, above 65, 70, and in some surveys, above 80% support for things like humanitarian assistance, medical aid, stopping diseases before they get to the US. And so for me, it's less about this idea of reaching the broader American public, although I think that is so crucial for so many reasons. For me, it's really about this policymaker information. And I think back to what Susie Wiles said in her Vanity Fair interview, where she said, everyone knows the good that USAID was doing. And so then you have to ask yourself, like, why is there this disconnect between what people know and what is happening? I do think there are a couple of things that made USAID and the international aid budget more at risk. One of them being that people collectively grossly overestimate how much money goes into international aid, putting it between 20 and 25% as opposed to the less than 1% that all of us on this call know it is. And so I do think trying to repackage, particularly for policymakers who should know, but don't always have a sense of it, of just the size of the budget that we're talking about is important. And then I also think it is more difficult, although as we have seen in the last year, not impossible, to break support for these programs when you have seen the impacts. Someone in the chat had mentioned codels. Those are so critical. The more that we can do to build a stronger bench with rising leaders as well, state representatives, mayors, governors, to
Can
really
you say what a codel is?
Yes, it's a congressional delegation visiting it can be to many places, but particularly for USAID, it was about seeing aid programs in action. It's not, unfortunately, as we have seen in the last year, it's not a foolproof protection, but it really goes a long way to helping make sure that people are advocating and protecting the programs when it comes to the budget decisions. My hope is that we're in a unique period where we won't see this kind of widespread attack again. But again, that's why I think it's so important to really communicate the size of the budget, the impact that we're talking about, and the people behind it, to Catherine's really important storytelling point.
William, I do want to turn to you to answer this question too, but related to it, we received a question which Jessica, what you were saying makes me think of. So it says, given the low public concern, is this the right fight we should pick right now? And I think it is. And so I would like to hear what you think, William.
Yeah, okay, I can respond to both of those. I mean, there was a study that came out last week in the journal, The Lancet Public Health, that estimated the number of deaths that will be caused, not just from the reduction in American foreign aid, although largely, but also across the West. And they place over the next 4 years, so by 2030, the most comprehensive model to date. It's about 9.4 million people, so that's about a Holocaust and a half. So yeah, I think it is an important fight to be having right at this moment. I do think, to the earlier question, I think that we could pick a few focuses. I mean, some of the biggest successes we had in aid beyond fighting HIV were saving lives through providing American-grown food to avert famine. I actually would like to bring Catherine in here. She's spoken from the Midwest perspective on what would be required to build that to a point of regional pride in farming communities or in Midwestern communities.
Catherine, do you want to answer that quickly?
Yeah, I mean, I've only been here for 6 months, but so I'm reintegrating and understanding exactly what motivates people and really what connects an understanding of how U.S. foreign policy and U.S. foreign assistance and how it directly impacts communities regionally. I think working with chambers of commerce, working with community groups, working with farmers unions, so that they can also tell the story really helps. Sometimes I think when we're thinking about communicating from the government sense, we don't think about what resonates with the community and can they be brought in. Stakeholders should be brought in when messages are being created, because they're the ones who know what resonates. They're the ones who know where the messages should be, where real engagement happens, how it can grow, how can you leverage and understand who they can reach and how we can reach them more effectively. So I don't think it's something that I can tell those that we need to reach. I think it's really is bringing people into the conversation so that they can be more effective storytellers on behalf of the U.S. government. Because really, is their money being spent. So being able to ensure that they can tell that story effectively is really what makes the big difference. Because I remember for example, when I was managing exchange programs, I could be blue in the face. I could have the ambassador tell 1,000,000 times over how participating in an exchange program would change the lives of those around them. But if the participants couldn't tell the story, if they weren't the ones advocating for this amazing program and they weren't physically going out and advertising and trying to find the next promising cohort, we weren't going to get those that we were trying to bring into the program. So it really is about figuring out what resonates and having people advocate on your behalf, because that's really where the difference gets made.
Thank you. I want to go back to the question of the students and the future. Whenever we have one of these programs, we hear from the students in the audience who say, we're watching everything that's happening in government. Is there a future for us there? Should we keep pushing forward to join the Foreign Service? And obviously the situation for those who wanted to study or who are currently in international development programs is even bleaker. So maybe Jessica, could you at least start us on this discussion of what kind of guidance and support can we give to these students who, really want to be in this space but are seeing this incredible disruption? And then William, I'll want to hear from you as well.
One thing that was incredible to me working at USAID and working with so many colleagues across the State Department was the diversity of backgrounds, that so many people came from such different walks of life, different states, different regions, some had studied in university on exactly this. For example, I did public relations and international policy. Like this was the path I always wanted to do. But so many people come to this later in life. And so there's not one option for how we should reach this rising generation. But the most important thing, and I'm going to keep repeating Catherine here, is we have to tell our stories and pull down the mask behind the diplomats. My wider family is from the Midwest, and it's always interesting to explain to them what I'm doing, where I'm at in the world, why I'm doing the things that I'm doing. And so everyone is a spokesperson. And so the more that we empower that, the more we recognize that, and the more that we talk to people about the journeys that our careers took us on and the spaces that it took us to, the more powerful we collectively are. And again, this is such a unique moment with so many more people interested in development, in the impacts of USAID's dismantling, and what is happening around the world right now, that we really do have to seize this moment. And that's most important with the youngest generation that's coming up in leadership right now.
William, any words of advice for budding
No,
international
Jessica, I think
development?
Jessica said it great. I don't think I have anything to add.
Okay. Well, on that note, I see we're nearing the end of the hour. We did get a lot of questions, and I think you've already provided kind of a roadmap as to, okay, what do we do about this? I think people in this time feel helpless and want to have really a roadmap. So what can I, as an individual, as Naja, do to help advance this messaging and this dialogue? And I do think you've provided um, I think, good suggestions on. Is there anything else that we want to share in terms of collectively or individually? What can we do in this moment to continue advancing the dialogue about international development, about public service, about the work that needs to happen and that's been stopped? Who do I start with? Let's start with Catherine. And then I'll go to William.
Thank you all so much for your awesome input. I think it's such an interesting opportunity to hear three unique points of view. So I really appreciate learning from you all too. I am a big advocate of using the platform that you have in order to tell the story that you need to tell. And I think that there is no time for invisibility. There's no time for shying away from this moment. If you feel passionately about U.S. foreign policy and the need for the continued U.S. engagement, it's an opportunity to not only use historical moments to talk about the ways that we can improve, because the U.S. is not a perfect place. But we do have a unique opportunity where our government constantly is trying to, and there are foreign policy actors who are constantly trying to improve and use lessons learned in order to improve our standing in the world. I think that it's time for the U.S. foreign policy apparatus to get outside of the bubble, to actually talk to average Americans about their understanding of U.S. foreign policy. Oftentimes I'll go to events, fireside chats, and it is experts talking at people rather than talking with them, understanding where their perspective is, really hearing the questions that are being asked, really seeing where there's a disconnect between the bubble of U.S. foreign policy and that foreign policy blob and what people are experiencing day to day in America. I mean, there is real struggle here that's happening in the United States. And if you want people to really care about diplomacy and development, you need to come out here and see, like, what are students worried about? What are parents worried about? Why do they need to keep engaging with the rest of the world? Why does it matter? I mean, the amount of foreign students that come through universities, that's their first taste of America. And their time that they have interacting with American students in university settings really sets the trajectory of sometimes how they understand the United States and how we operate. And it's also an opportunity for American students to understand American culture and, I mean, to understand foreign cultures. So I do think that it's time for the bubble to burst. It is also time for people who've served the American government in a variety of capacities to use their platform. Use LinkedIn, use Substack, use video. You have a platform. When I first started talking and speaking about U.S. foreign policy, it was in May of last year, and I left the Foreign Service in July. And I try to use it try to use my platforms on a daily basis, and explaining and connecting these really big foreign policy issues and challenges, and connecting it and explaining it to my audience and my platform and the students and the people that I interact with on a daily basis. So it doesn't have to be a wide systemic change. It could really start in your backyard, in your neighborhood. When people ask me where I was living before I was living in Indiana 6 months ago, I'll say Brunei. And then that unlocks a whole conversation about what I was doing on behalf of the U.S. government, on behalf of the U.S. people, and on behalf of Americans. And I love opportunities to talk about the work and why it matters. So I think that if you're on this call and you've have served the U.S. government, or you've worked in some capacity in furthering and developing U.S. foreign policy, now is your moment to really unlock this opportunity and to use your corner of the world to tell your story. And it doesn't matter if you have 15 or 20 or 3 million followers, like, it all can make a difference. And while we don't have the same institutions that we had before in order to talk in one voice, we do have an opportunity to keep repeating and keep telling the story and over again in a really concerted way, and in a way that's personalized. My own mother would watch, for example, The Diplomat and say, "Is that really what you used to do day to day?" And then that unlocks a whole moment of like explanation and talking about like what U.S. foreign policy and where the real nuggets of truth are in shows like that. So I think the moment is now for everybody to really tell that story and to really think about who you're communicating with and who you can listen to, and how you can listen to them better as well. Thank you.
Thank you. That was excellent advice, and I think absolutely timely. And I'm sorry, we are 1 minute to go, and I want to have Nikki address one final question that has come up a few times about what is AFSA doing? Because obviously AFSA is, our tagline is the voice of the Foreign Service. We represent the U.S. Foreign Service, and we represent the U.S. Foreign Service to the American public, especially. And we do get this question a lot. What are we doing to let the American public know about what's happening? So I want Nikki to talk a little bit about this month, especially in the campaign that we are having to commemorate the 1 year since the attacks on USAID began, and then how people can take a part of this campaign. Back to what Catherine was saying, this is the time. You got the networks, you've got a platform, you can just start typing away. Nikki?
Excellent. I can just see from the chat, everyone, our panel was amazing and great perspectives from the field. William having been out in the field in comms, Catherine being in the Foreign Service, Jessica leading USAID comms. I just want to thank you each for coming, spending an hour with us, explaining this, because it seems to be of great interest. So just a huge thank you to our panel. Catherine, come off mic and tell us, what is your Substack? Because I love good writing, and this is not an AFSA endorsement, but I want to say Catherine has a Substack that she shares her stories. So what is that?
It's still I notice everything.substack.com.
Still I notice everything.substack.com. That's not an AFSA endorsement. That's a my endorsement. She's a great writer.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
And then, like as Na just said, we're recognizing for the month of February the 1 year commemoration of USAID. If you want to find out more about that, go to servicedisrupted.org and sign up for our newsletter. On February 27th, we are going to have a rally outside of the Ronald Reagan building at noon, February 27th at noon. If you want to find more about that, sign up for our newsletter, servicedisrupted.org. And if you are out in the DC area, we really encourage all friends, family, former USAiders to come out and be counted in that moment. Anyway, we're out of time. Thank you so much. Check out our newsletter. And again, thank you to our panelists for joining us, and have an excellent afternoon, everyone.